Welcome to Day Music, and we will be talking about the Beatles. The Beatles were an English rock band formed in Liverpool in 1960. The core lineup of the band comprised John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr. They are widely regarded as the most influential band of all time. They were integral to the development of 1960s counterculture and the recognition of popular music as an art form. The Beatles are the best-selling music act of all time, with estimated sales of 600 million units worldwide. They are the most successful act in the history of the US Billboard chart sites. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in their first year of eligibility, 1988 and 2004, and 2011. The group topped Rolling Stone's lists of the greatest artists in history. Time magazine named them among the 20th century's 100 most important people. The Beatles arrived in Hamburg in mid-August 1960. They were contracted to club owner Bruno Koschmider for what would be a 2-month residency. During the next 2 years, the Beatles were resident for periods in Hamburg. They used Preludin both recreationally and to maintain their energy through all-night performances. Epstein negotiated an early end to the band's contract with Polydor. In exchange for more recordings, backing Tony Sheridan after a New Year's Day audition, Decca Records rejected the band, saying guitar groups are on the way out. Mr. Epstein, however, 3 months later, producer George Martin signed the Beatles to Emily's Parlophone label. The Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, was released in March 1963. It was the first of 11 consecutive Beatles albums released in the United Kingdom to reach number 1. The band's third single, From Me to You, came out in April and began an almost unbroken string of 17 British number 1 singles, including all but one of the 18 they released. With the Beatles became the second album in UK chart history to sell 1 million copies, a figure previously reached only by the 1958 South Pacific Sound. It held the top spot for 21 weeks with a chart life of 40 weeks, in a reversal of then standard practice. KEMEA released the album ahead of the impending single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, with the song excluded to maximize the single sales. The Beatles' first visit to the US took place when the nation was still mourning the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. The previous November, the group's popularity generated unprecedented interest in British music, and many other UK acts subsequently made their American debuts. The Beatles' success in the US opened the door for a successive string of British beat groups and pop acts to achieve success in America. The Beatles' third album, A Hard Day's Night, was released in 1964. It was the group's first studio album and saw them truly coming into their own as a band. The album was the first to feature Harrison's 12-string electric Rickenbacker, a prototype given to him by the manufacturer. The Beatles' fourth studio LP, Beatles for Sale, evidenced the growing conflict between the commercial pressures of their global success and their creative ambitions. Released in early December, its 8 original compositions stood out, demonstrating the growing maturity of the Lennon and McCartney songwriting partnership in early 1965. Following a dinner with Lennon, Harrison and their wives, Harrison's dentist, John Riley, secretly added LSD to their coffee in July 1965, the Beatles' second film, Help, was released. Again directed by Lester, the soundtrack was dominated by Lennon, who wrote and sang lead on most of its songs, including the 2 singles, Help and Ticket to Ride the group's third US tour, opened with a performance before a world record crowd of 55,600. Rubber Soul was released in 1966 on Capitol Records. Harrison's introduction of a sitar on Norwegian wood, This Bird Has Flown, marked a further progression outside the traditional boundaries of popular music. It was the band's first foray into classical music with Flutes and Strings. Revolver was released in August 1966. A week before the Beatles' final tour, the album featured sophisticated songwriting, studio experimentation, and a greatly expanded repertoire of musical styles. The the Vatican issued a protest, and bans on Beatles records were imposed by Spanish and Dutch stations. The Beatles recorded Sest. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in November 1966. The sessions initially yielded the non-album double, a side single Strawberry Fields Forever Penny Lane in February 1967. The band's concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park on 29 August was their last commercial concert as Sheet. Pepper topped the UK charts for 23 consecutive weeks, with a further 4 weeks at number 1 in the period through to February 1968, with 5 million copies sold within 3 months of its release. As CQT, Pepper's initial commercial success exceeded that of all previous Beatles albums. It was the first rock album to win the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. The Magical Mystery Tour soundtrack was released in the UK as a 6-track double extended play EP in early December 1967. The record carried on the psychedelic vein of Sgt. Pepper, though in line with the band's wishes. The packaging reinforced the idea that the release was a film soundtrack rather than a follow-up in the US. The soundtrack appeared as an identically titled LP that also included 5 tracks from the group's recent singles. In May 1968, the group recorded what became the Beatles, a double LP commonly known as the White Album for its virtually featureless cover during this time. Relations between the members grew openly divisive. Tensions were further aggravated by Lennon's romantic preoccupation with avant-garde artist Yoko Ono, whom he insisted on bringing to the sessions that it was the Beatles' final album release, but was largely recorded before Abbey Road, originally intended for a 1-hour television program to be called Beatles at Work. Harrison walked out for 5 days and threatened to leave the band unless they abandoned all talk of live performance and instead focused on finishing a new album. Much of the album's content came from studio work beginning in January 1969. New strains developed between the band members regarding the appointment of a financial advisor, the need for which had become evident without Epstein to manage business affairs. Lennon, Harrison and Starr favored Alan Klein, who had managed the Rolling Stones, and Sam Cooke. McCartney wanted Lee and John Eastman, father and brother respectively of Linda Eastman, whom McCartney married on 12 March. Agreement could not be reached, so both Klein and the Eastmans were temporarily appointed, Klein as the Beatles' business, Lennon McCartney. Harrison and Starr all released solo albums in 1970. Their solo records sometimes involved one or more of the other members. Starr's Ringo 1973 was the only album to include compositions and performances by all 4 ex-Beatles, albeit on separate songs, true double LP sets of the Beatles' greatest hits, compiled by Klein, 1962, 1966, and 1967-1970, were released in 1973, between 1976 and 1982. EMI Capitol released a wave of compilation albums without input from the ex-Beatles. Accompanying the wave of Beatles nostalgia and persistent reunion rumors in the US during the 1970s, several entrepreneurs made public offers to the Beatles for a reunion concert. The Beatles' studio albums were released on CD by EMI and Apple Corps in 1987. In 1988, the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame the following year. EMI Capitol settled a decade-long lawsuit filed by the band over royalties in 1994. McCartney, Harrison and Starr collaborated on the anthology project during 1995-96. The project yielded a television miniseries, an 8-volume video set, and 3 Tooth Beatles One, a compilation album of the band's British and American number 1 hits, was released on 13 November 2000 out. It became the fastest-selling album of all time, with 36 million sold in its first week and 13 million within a month. In 2003, a reconceived version of the Let It Be album was released in 2009. The Beatles' entire back catalogue was reissued following an extensive digital remastering process that lasted 4 years in 2010. The official canon of 13 Beatles studio albums, past masters, and the Red and Blue Greatest Hits albums were made available on iTunes in 2012. EMI's recorded music operations were sold to Universal Music Group in 2013, a second volume of BBC recording. On Air Live at the BBC Volume 2 was released in December 2015. The Beatles released their catalogue for streaming on various streaming music services, including Spotify and Apple Music. On 18 May 2017, Sirius XM Radio launched a 24/7 radio channel, the Beatles channel. A week later, CGT, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, was reissued with new stereo mixes and unreleased material for the album's 50th anniversary. Similar box sets were released for the Beatles in November 2018 and Abbey Road in September 2019. On the first week of October 2019, Abbey Road returned to number 1 on the UK albums chart in November 2021. The Beatles' earliest influences include Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Gene Vincent. Chuck Berry was particularly influential in terms of songwriting and lyrics. Other early influences include Buddy Holly, Eddie Cochran, Roy Orbison, the Everly Brothers, and Jerry Lee Lewis. The Beatles found new musical and lyrical avenues by listening to their contemporaries, including Bob Dylan, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, The Who, Frank Zappa, The Lovin' Spoonful, The Birds and the Beach Boys, Ravi Shankar, with whom Harrison studied for 6 weeks in India in late 1966, had a significant effect on his musical development. George Martin's close involvement in his role as producer made him one of the leading candidates for the informal title of the fifth Beatle. He applied his classical musical training in various ways. Originating as a skiffle group, the Beatles quickly embraced 1950s rock and roll and functioned as an informal music teacher to the songwriters. Martin often performed on recordings, playing instruments including piano, organ and brass. The Beatles' arrival in the US in 1964 is credited with initiating the album era. The British poet Philip Larkin described their work as an enchanting and intoxicating hybrid of Negro rock and roll with their own adolescent romanticism. The Beatles are regarded as British cultural icons. They augmented their songs with instruments that were unconventional in rock music at the time. Their musical innovations and commercial success inspired musicians worldwide. Many artists have enjoyed chart success with covers of their songs. The Beatles are the best-selling band in history, having sold more than 600 million units as of 2012. From 1991 to 2009, the Beatles sold 57 million albums in the United States, according to Nielsen SoundScan. They have had more number 1 albums on the UK charts, 15, and sold more singles in the UK, 219 million. The Beatles won the 1971 Academy Award for Best Original Song Score for the film Let It Be 1970. Harrison created Harry songs to represent his Beatles compositions than any other act, but signed a 3-year contract with Northern Songs that gave it the copyright to his work through March 1968. In March 1969, James arranged to sell his and his partner's shares of Northern Songs to the British broadcasting company Associated Television (ATV). The band then made a bid to gain a controlling interest by attempting to work out a deal with a consortium of London brokerage firms that had accumulated in 1985, founded by impresario Lou Grade. Michael Jackson purchased ATV for a reported $475 million. The acquisition gave him control of the publishing rights to more than 200 Beatles songs, as well as 40 other copyrights. In 1995, Jackson merged his music publishing business with Sony, creating a new company, Sony ATV Music Publishing, in which he held a 50% stake in 2016. Sony acquired Jackson's share of Sony ATV from the Jackson estate for $750. Thanks for watching the video. See you next time.